Good evening. Hello. Welcome back to another edition of Trek Talk, a live stream where I talk about an episode of the original Star Trek series, both the episode itself and the behind the scenes making of the film. Okay, so this week episode, we're looking at This Side of Paradise. This is episode 25 in production order. And hello, Adega. Good to see you, sir. Thank you for stopping by as always. Um, okay, so as always, I'm going to be looking at Mark Cushman's book. These are the voyages for some of the behind the scenes information. This is definitely one of the classic Star Trek episodes. One of those classic ones where some force is affecting the crew. And Kirk is the only one who can kind of resist it. And it's also one of the episodes, of course, where Kirk has to kind of like pick a fight with Spock and get him angry, which happened a few times. Okay, so now I will begin by reading from Mark Cushman's book. And by the way, this episode, the story was by Nathan Butler, aka Jerry Soule and DC Fontana. The teleplay was by DC Fontana, directed by Ralph Sinensky. Now, this is from an NBC press release for March 2nd of 1967. Jill Ireland guest stars as Layla, the first woman with whom the normally unemotional Mr. Spock falls in love, following the discovery of a drug-like plant in This Side of Paradise on NBC Television Network's Colorcast of Star Trek. Expecting to find no sign of life on the planet Omicron Ceti 3, which has been bombarded by deadly space rays, Captain Kirk is amazed when his landing party is greeted by botanist Layla and colony ruler Sandoval. Apparently unaware of the danger that surrounds them, the group rejects Kirk's evacuation order. Before Kirk realizes the entire settlement is infected by a plant which induces a false sense of security and happiness, his own crew is similarly infected, including Spock, whose romance with the stunning Layla leads him to open defiance of his captain. This Side of Paradise offers an examination of duty and responsibility, the dangers of repressed emotions, and a warning for the growing drug culture of the 1960s. This is Star Trek at its best. Science fiction blended with surprising humor and gut wrenching drama, seamlessly interwoven through purposeful writing and inspired direction. This Side of Paradise, at its core, is a heavily disguised anti drug statement. When made in 1967, a large segment of America's youth were choosing to turn on and tune out. And this desertion of America's young, left the straight and sober feeling betrayed and abandoned, much like the lonely, brooding captain of the Enterprise. In the earlier episode, The Naked Time, Spock experienced emotion, but it was painful. Here he admits for the first time in his life he is happy. He grins from ear to pointed ear, hangs upside down in a tree, laughs and gazes at the sky, imagining dragons in the clouds, and he feels love. These are stirring and unforgettable images, equally burned into the memory. Spock's display of surprise, hurt, and then homicidal fury as Kirk verbally attacks him. And finally, the terrible sadness when he realizes that his ability to experience love and to laugh was merely temporary. This Side of Paradise is a story about Spock, but it also rings strong for Layla Kalomi and Elias Sandoval. The audience is taken by her sadness when Layla says to Spock, "I've lost you, haven't I? Not just you, but all of it. The spores, too. I've lost them, too. And somehow this is for my good." And then Sandoval, with his somber realization, "We've done nothing here. No progress, no accomplishments. 3 years wasted." But Paradise, as with all Star Trek stories, is primarily about Kirk. The captain spoke of his loneliness in The Naked Time, how his life was obsessively devoted to a she known as the Enterprise. Now we discover the depth of his inner torment. Without its heart and soul, her crew, Kirk's beautiful ship is not whole. The captain has never looked lonelier than when he steps onto the deserted bridge. Even when presented even when presented with a chance for paradise, the tormented Kirk is too driven and too tortured for the spores to take hold. And there's more. We see Dr. McCoy unburdened by duty and the determination to live his life for others. There was a hint of his southern roots in Shore Leave, but no hinting around here. It is rare and certainly special when a 1 hour drama restricted by the format of a continuing series can service so many characters so effectively. Okay. Now we'll just go ahead, I guess, and get into the episode proper here. So we begin with the Enterprise in orbit around Omicron Ceti 3, a planet which hosts a Federation colony with 150 people. However, the planet is being bombarded by Berthold rays, which are lethal. Spock is confident that the colonists are likely dead, and the colony isn't responding to hails either. Spock says they can risk beaming down for a brief period to investigate. They arrive and find that not only are the colonists alive, but they're doing quite well. This presents a puzzle, and Kirk wants an explanation from the colony's leader, Elias Sandoval. Now, at Sandoval's home, we meet Layla, the colony's botanist, a woman who has a shared past with Mr. Spock. Sulu and the biologist, I forget his name, but they check out the surroundings and notice that there doesn't seem to be any farm animals or animal life at all, for that matter. Later, Sandoval and Layla discuss Spock, and Sandoval asks if she wants him to stay with the colony. And she says that there is no choice to be made. He will be staying. McCoy then tells Kirk that he's examined 9 of the colonists and all of them are in perfect health with no issues of any kind. Spock contacts Kirk and tells him about the complete absence of any life except for the plant life and the colonists. Kirk notes that they brought livestock to the planet for breeding when the planet was first settled 4 years ago. Lieutenant Kellerman notes that they have several crops, but they're actually growing fairly little food, just enough for the colony to survive, but nothing more. Then McCoy, after reviewing the medical records for the colony, tells Kirk that Sandoval's records indicate that he had scar tissue in his lungs from pneumonia as a child and had his appendix removed, but when he scanned Sandoval, the scar tissue was absent and he has an appendix. Kirk then tells Sandoval that Starfleet has ordered the colony to be evacuated, but Sandoval refuses, saying that they don't want to leave. Meanwhile, Spock is inspecting. Nanker says, "Fix your audio." Is it not loud enough? Is that the problem? Is it not loud enough, or am I roboting or something? Oh, it's fixed now? Okay. Yeah, that's kind of why I was late. I was having sound problems, or I would have started at 6. Okay. So where was I? Okay, so Spock is inspecting the garden, and he notices that there aren't even any insects. Layla says that she can explain that. She takes Spock to some flowering plants, and they spray him with some spores that seem to remove his emotional barriers. And Spock immediately confesses that he loves Layla. Sandoval makes it clear that the colonists will not cooperate with the evacuation. And Kirk contacts Spock to inform him of the evacuation order, but Spock behaves strangely, dismissing the evacuation order and then discards his communicator. While Kirk was looking for Spock, Lieutenant LaSalle, that's his name, LaSalle, not Kellerman. Lieutenant LaSalle brings a pair of these spore plants to Dr. McCoy, suggesting that the doctor take a closer look at them. Kirk, Sulu, and the biologist go looking for Spock, and they find him frolicking, of all things, with Layla. Kirk asks why Spock didn't report back as ordered, and Spock just says, I didn't want to, Jim. Kirk tells Layla to return to the colony for the evacuation, but Spock says there won't be any evacuation. Kirk tells Layla to return to the colony. But Spock then takes them to some of the spore plants, and the three of them all get sprayed with the spores. Sulu and the biologist are clearly affected, but Kirk isn't for some reason. We'll find out why later. And insists that the evacuation will go ahead as ordered. Back at the colony, McCoy is clearly now under the influence of the spores, which are causing him to, not only is it making him happy, but he's now speaking in a thick southern drawl when he didn't before. And okay, so it was distorted before. Okay, like I was roboting or something. Tripping Spock, indeed. Okay, okay, so he tells Kirk that over 100 of the plants have been beamed up to the Enterprise. Kirk beams up and he tells Uhura to contact Starfleet Command. But she tells Kirk that all the communications are out because she sabotaged the circuits. She then leaves, assuring Captain Kirk that it's all for the best. Kirk becomes angry, noticing one of the spore plants, and he hurls it across the bridge, leaving it laying on the floor. Okay, later he finds crewmen that are waiting in line to beam down to the planet. He orders them all back to the stations, their stations, but they refuse to. He speaks to this crewman here. Now, this is Eddie Paskey, who, of course, I've talked about before, and he's one of the kind of recurring background characters. Now, he's played a character called Lieutenant Kelly, but in this episode, he's just referred to as crewman, so I don't know why. Anyway, he's the one who refuses. And Kirk says, "This is mutiny, mister." And he says, "Yeah, yeah, it is." Now, soon the spores have spread throughout the entire ship, and everyone is affected, and they all start beaming down en masse. And Kirk is helpless to do anything to stop them, short of maybe phasering them. He's also puzzled as to why he isn't affected, and he contacts McCoy to ask him what he thinks. But McCoy, again, who's now talking like a character out of Inherit the Wind, isn't interested in discussing the matter, and instead asks Kirk if he's ever had a good mint julep. So Kirk beams down and confronts Spock and Sandoval. Spock tells Kirk that the spores drifted through space, eventually landing on Omicron Ceti 3. These plants thrive on Berthold rays, and they give their hosts perfect health and peace of mind. Sandoval encourages Kirk to join them, saying that they have a perfect life here. But Kirk rejects that idea, saying, man wasn't meant to have a perfect existence. Man stagnates if he doesn't have something to struggle against. We weren't made for paradise. He returns to his now empty bridge, contacting engineering and security and other departments, and gets no response. He's apparently completely alone on the ship. Which makes you wonder how he beamed up in the first place if there was no one there to operate the transporter, but okay, never mind. Maybe there was. He dictates a log entry explaining the situation and admits he sees no way of getting his crew back, and says, what do I have to offer that can compare with paradise? Then one of the spore plants, which can move, what the hell, sprays Kirk with the spores. And now the spores affect him. And then he contacts Spock, saying that he understands now. It all makes sense. Kathleen Kennedy's doing a great job with Star Wars. Agatha All Along is a fantastic streaming show. Taylor Swift is a great singer. Okay, so he contacts Spock and tells him he understands. He then goes to his quarters to gather some personal things before beaming down. And I love this because he's got a suitcase and it's just a 1960s suitcase. You know, they didn't even attempt to make a prop. It's just it's just your standard suitcase from that period. Uh, then he looks into his some of his personal effects and finds a medal, presumably a Starfleet award of some kind. But then he becomes angry and he puts it aside and goes to the transporter room. But in the transporter room, he hesitates before beaming down and angrily refuses to go, saying, "No, I can't leave." He then snaps out of the trance and realizes that emotion, specifically strong anger, can counteract the spore's influence. He then plans to lure Spock up to the ship and confront him and anger Spock, but notes that Spock is much stronger than a human and he could easily kill Kirk if sufficiently angered. So he calls Spock and tells him there's some equipment he wants Spock's assistance with. And Spock beams up, and then we get one of the classic Star Trek scenes where Kirk confronts him and says, "All right, you mutinous computerized half-breed, we'll see about you mutinying on my ship. What makes you think you're a man? You're an overgrown jackrabbit, an elf with an hyperactive thyroid." And Spock is kind of laughs at this and says he really doesn't understand what Kirk is talking about. Kirk says, "Of course you don't understand. You don't have a brain. All you have is printed circuits." Spock then becomes annoyed and decides to leave, but Kirk blocks him, saying, "What can you expect from a simpering, devil-eating freak whose father was a computer, his mother an encyclopedia? A traitor from a race of traitors. The Vulcan never lived who had an ounce of integrity. Disloyal to the core. Rotten like the rest of your subhuman race. And you have the nerve to make love to that girl." And that's what really ticks Spock off when he says that. And he's like, "Okay, that is enough." And she says, "Does she know what she's getting, Spock? A carcass full of memory banks who should be sitting on a mushroom instead of passing himself off as a man. You belong in a circus, Spock, not a starship. Right next to the dog-faced boy." Then Spock loses it and starts wiping the floor with Kirk. And it was at this moment that Captain Kirk realized he had effed up. But fortunately, it's also the same moment that Spock snaps out of the spore trance. Spock realizes with some disappointment that the spore's influence is gone. And then Kirk explains how anger can counteract the spores, but Spock notes that initiating a brawl with over 400 crewmen seems like an illogical course to take. Kirk then suggests creating a device that can emit a sonic pulse over the communication channels, and Spock says that he can do that. He then notes that he also notes that striking a superior officer is a court-martial offense, but then says, Kirk counters saying that, well, if we're both in the brig, who's going to create the sonic device? And Spock agrees that that's a logical observation. Now, on the planet, Layla borrows McCoy's communicator and asks Spock if she can beam up to the ship, as she's never seen a starship before. After beaming up, she quickly realizes that Spock is no longer of the body and urges him to beam back down again, but Spock refuses. She says that they couldn't be together on Earth, but here they could have a life under the spore's influence. But he says that he has a responsibility to his ship and his captain. Now, on the bridge, Spock notes that the sonic pulse will be inaudible, but will cause irritation, hopefully leading to everyone on the planet becoming angry and short-tempered. Kirk compares it to itching powder, which I don't know. I don't know if that's a good example, but sure enough, fights start breaking out. Sandoval confronts McCoy. This is another funny scene. He confronts McCoy saying he needs to figure out what kind of work he's going to have McCoy doing. And McCoy says, well, I'm a doctor. But Sandoval notes that the spores give us all perfect health, so we don't really need a doctor, so you're going to have to do something else. And then McCoy says, well, you'd better make me a mechanic so I can treat little tin gods like you. And then they start to fight, but they quickly snap out of it. And then Sandoval contacts Kirk and says that the colonists will cooperate with the evacuation. Later, as they're leaving the planet, McCoy notes that this is the second time man has been cast out of paradise. But Kirk says that this time they walked out, arguing that man wasn't meant for paradise. We were meant to claw, struggle, fight our way through. Kirk then notes that Spock has been very quiet and asks him his thoughts. And he says that he has little to add other than that for the first time in his life, he was happy. And again, directed by Ralph Sinensky, teleplay by DC Fontana, story by Nathan Butler, with guest star Jill Ireland and special guest star Frank Overton. And I give this one an A plus. Absolutely, definitely one of the classic Star Trek episodes. Really enjoy it. Just a fun episode of television. Nick says should have stayed on the planet. Cheers. Thank you. I agree. Maybe it would have been better. It it poses this episode poses an interesting uh, discussion because really, I mean, would they have been better off if Kirk had just left them all? It's a interesting discussion. They were happy, they were healthy. Now, granted, it was sort of you could say it was artificial, and not legitimate, but I don't know. It kind of reminds me what's that story in Greek mythology about the lotus eaters, where they kind of get into this trance. Okay. So let me go back to Cushman's book here. Okay, so Jerry Soule, having written the Corbomite maneuver, returned for a second Star Trek episode by invitation of Gene Roddenberry. Of his pitch to Roddenberry, Soule said, spores, as you know, are inanimate up to the point where they are mixed with water or with anything else. Then they come alive. So I had the idea that these things could be consumed by someone, and as a result, the whole character chemistry of that person could change to a nice, peaceful, and loving person. The Naked Time showed us what could happen if everyone on the Enterprise were drunk. Soule took it a step further. He said it was a psychedelic kind of thing. A lot of that was going on at the time. The premise of the thing was that everyone on the Enterprise takes LSD. Then what would happen? Now, Roddenberry put Soule on assignment. His story, first called Sandoval's Planet and then retitled Power Play, and then retitled again to Way of the Spores, actually had Sulu, not Spock, falling in love. And the spores were at the bottom of a well, described as thousands of puffballs, very colored and luminescent and moving about. Robert Justman was the first to react to the June 15, 1966 story outline for Sandoval's Planet. He wrote Roddenberry, I have just read Jerry Soule's treatment. I have to confess to you that I ended up very confused. I can't seem to make any sense of the story. And I think all the sub stories really only tend to confuse the issue. I don't know which story is the main line of the treatment. Now, with Roddenberry pulling back from his producer's responsibilities and Gene Coon just starting to find his way at Star Trek, Soule was advised to go to script with few notes, other than, as always, to try and keep it cheap. The first draft arrived on September 1st. A collection of the staff notes from Roddenberry, Justman, and Karabatsos told of many concerns. One note said, quote, "The dialogue is miserable, and there is a lack of characterization. We keep losing sight of people, like Sandoval and Layla, then dragging them in by the heels when we need them. Recommend cutting and trimming since the script is long now. Straight line the action and have Kirk acting like the trained ship captain we know he is." Of Soule's second draft, now called Way of the Spores, the notes from the staff included the following, quote, "This is better than it was, certainly more straight line and logical. The dialogue has also sharpened. One specific request, change that title." Soule did a free polish on the script dated October 16th, but neglected to change the title. In fact, he neglected to change much of anything. So Roddenberry and Coon collectively decided to change the writer. Okay, so at this point, we're going to talk about DC Fontana, because she was the one they brought in to basically fix this script. As the stories Roddenberry assigned began arriving, many were proving to be unsuitable. Star Trek was in danger of running short on scripts. Coon would give out 6 additional writing assignments in December, all to writers who had proven themselves reliable. One assignment each went to Paul Schneider, who wrote an episode called Tomorrow the Universe, Theodore Sturgeon, who would write Amok Time, Stephen Karabatsos, who would write an episode titled Operation Destroy, which would eventually become Operation Annihilate, and the final 2 Coon assigned to himself, The Devil in the Dark and Errand of Mercy. Stephen Karabatsos' contract as Star Trek's story editor was for 13 episodes, ending with A Taste of Armageddon. Karabatsos later admitted that he was not a fan of science fiction and had far less exposure to the genre than series writers and sci-fi enthusiasts. For Karabatsos, Star Trek was no better or worse than the other series he had worked on, like Peyton Place. He said, quote, "The honest fact is that when it was first on, to me, it was just another show. Granted, because of all the famous science fiction writers involved, there was a sense of something else, a sense of more going on. But you have to understand, nobody knew what we had. Nobody had any idea. Star Trek didn't light up the stars." Roddenberry would argue with that. Most who worked on the series did feel that Star Trek was something special, but not Karabatsos. 25 years after leaving the series, he said, quote, "It beats the hell out of me why the show has gone on the way it has," unquote. Roddenberry, wait, where am I? Okay, yeah. So Karabatsos had one last contractual obligation: write an original script. He had been given co-writing credit on Court Martial, which was a rewrite. He didn't have a storyline his bosses liked, so Roddenberry gave him one. Karabatsos went home to work on Operation Destroy and left an empty office in the Star Trek building. Roddenberry, Justman, and Coon already knew who they wanted to put in that desk. Dorothy Fontana's gamble, resigning as Roddenberry's secretary to become a full-fledged screenwriter, had paid off. Now her former boss had nothing to lose in offering her a shot at being on staff. Nonetheless, for 1966, it was a bold move. As Fontana would later say, quote, "To have a woman story editor on an action-adventure show, that was unheard of at the time." Fontana brought much to the table. The 2 scripts she had already contributed, Charlie X and Tomorrow is Yesterday, were among the show's least problematic in terms of budget. They required less rewriting and were 2 of the least expensive episodes filmed. And Fontana, unlike Karabatsos, embraced science fiction. She had watched The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits faithfully and admitted to loving Byron Haskin's movie Robinson Crusoe on Mars, as well as Forbidden Planet, the 1956 film that in many ways plays like an episode of Star Trek. Perhaps just as importantly, she loathes Lost in Space. Fontana had something else going for her. Along with a passion for writing, a story editor must know how to work within the system, to listen to the producers, to listen to the network, to understand budgets, and to know what is and what is not possible in terms of production. A story editor has to have a level of practical professionalism that many creative minded people in science fiction, especially, do not possess. Fontana explained, quote, I had dealt with the scripts all the time and had my own opinions about them. I just never put those thoughts down on paper. Although I spoke to Gene and Gene Kuhn secretly about the shows they were doing. Those conversations and her two original screenplays showed the two Genes that Fontana understood Star Trek as well as they did. She recalled, quote, Gene came to me and said, we have a script that's not working, and we'd like you to do a rewrite on it. And if you can do a fast rewrite that satisfies the network and the studio, then I'll invite you to join us as story editor. It was an offer a struggling writer who had just quit her day job couldn't refuse. And Fontana said, okay, what was handed to her would become This Side of Paradise. Fontana recalls, I looked at the script and thought about it, and there were two problems. One was the love interest was for Sulu. Nothing wrong with George Takei, and I really liked George, but he wasn't one of the heavyweight stars of the show. And if you're going to have a love story, you should have it with one of them. And with the Spores, you could make it Spock, and you could make it very emotional, harking back a little to the Naked Time. What would happen if Spock is out of control, only this time in terms of love? The other thing that was wrong with the episode was the spores themselves, which were an infection, but they were located in a cave, and they kind of fumbled and bounced around like ping pong balls. And so the answer to that dilemma is simple: don't go in the cave. So by making them part of a plant that was all over the planet, anybody could get infected at any time. With Fontana's rewrite, she had passed Roddenberry's test, and Star Trek found its new story editor. And with her script, Fontana added elements to the Star Trek lore. We knew before that Spock's mother was a human and his father Vulcan. Now it is established that his mother was a teacher and his father an ambassador. And we would later meet them in Journey to Babel, also written by Fontana. Robert Justman was ecstatic with her teleplay. He wrote to Kuhn, as usual, a shootable and well constructed final draft from the mysterious DC Fontana. In fact, Justman's memo only lasted 3 pages, unusually short for him. Fontana, too, was happy, saying, quote, the fact that Spock did not just disobeys an order from Kirk, but totally disregards it, that was a lot of fun. Nimoy, however, was less certain. Recalling a conversation with Fontana, he said, quote, I told her, it makes me nervous to hear you even talk about such a thing. I feel I've finally gotten a good grip on the character, and I don't want to lose what we have. The Vulcan was firmly established in my mind at that point, and the audience's, and a cool, distant character, and the very phrase Spock love story seemed oxymoronic. Jerry Soule would have objected too if he had known about the changes. On December 12, 1966, a day or two after Fontana turned in her second draft script, Soule wrote to Roddenberry asking, how's the way of the spores? I hope you shoot it. Since I haven't received any revised pages, I have the uneasy feeling it might have been put on a shelf somewhere. Roddenberry delayed saying anything. He knew Spores was going to be made, but with a different title, different authorship, and an entirely different approach. Kellum DeForest research had fewer peeves than usual, but did challenge the idea that a high degree of radiation bombarding the planet, as it had been described thus far, could accomplish what the story needed. Destruction of living tissue, thereby over a period of time killing people and animals, but not killing insects and vegetation. They told Gene Kuhn the general term living tissue would include all the plant life as well as the animal life on the planet. We suggest dialogue that indicates that the radiation destroys the red blood cells and bone marrow, which is more in line with the damage known that radiation causes and could conceivably not affect the vegetation. Kuhn felt that he had a better idea. For his December 15th final draft, the word radiation was removed from the script and replaced with Berthold rays. Spock explains, Berthold rays are such a recent discovery, we do not yet have a full knowledge of their nature. It is known that living animal tissue disintegrates under exposure after periods of as brief as 72 hours. A planet's atmosphere would cut some of the effects, but any sustained exposure would mean death. It was explanation enough to satisfy DeForest Research, and NBC was also satisfied and approved the script on December 19th. Later that day, Roddenberry finally wrote to Jerry Soule, trying to lay the blame on the network. His letter read, in part, quote, "We did a rewrite on The Way of the Spores. You probably got a copy of it by now. Much of the reason had to do with network pressure on this and that. I don't think your script was hurt by the rewrite at all. In fact, I wouldn't let it be. But with the end of your year coming up and with the second year of Star Trek soon to be decided, it is important we bend with NBC when it doesn't actually hurt the show." As Soule read Fontana's This Side of Paradise, he saw very little of his original material. So little, in fact, that not only he lost the teleplay credit, he had to share the story by credit. One of Star Trek's first writers and staunchest supporters was now feeling deeply betrayed. He would respond and vent his anger, but not for several days after This Side of Paradise had begun filming. Okay, so Ralph Sinesky was new to Star Trek, or Sininsky, excuse me. Sininsky began in television during the early 1960s. He proved his abilities on The Naked City, The Fugitive, 12 O'Clock High, and The Wild Wild West, where he worked with Gene Coon. It was Coon's idea to bring Sininsky to Star Trek and had him screen several episodes, which did not include the recently produced and semi-comical Tomorrow Was Yesterday. Sininsky saw nothing resembling comedy in the episodes he was shown. To the contrary, the series struck him as very dark, which is why he was pleased when, for his first Trek, he was offered The Devil in the Dark. Struck by the story, its theme, and its visual possibilities, Sininsky immediately knew how to approach the somber material. And then the script was taken away and given to Joseph Pevney to direct. In its place, Sininsky was assigned This Side of Paradise. Back then, before the experience of making it, seeing it, and witnessing its enduring popularity, Sininsky admitted, "I have to say I was disappointed. Devil in the Dark was a strange, eerie script where This Side of Paradise seemed almost like a modern love story." Now, Jill Ireland, I can bring her up here. She was 30 when she played Layla Kalomi, the girl from Spock's past. She had been a regular for 1 year in the 1966 TV version of Shane and had appeared in 5 episodes of The Man from U.N.C.L.E. with her real life husband, David McCallum. After Star Trek and after McCallum, Ireland's acting career prospered through numerous big screen co starring roles with her second husband, Charles Bronson, in The Mechanic, The Valachi Papers, and Death Wish 2. Ireland had been watching Star Trek. She had recently seen What Are Little Girls Made Of and came to the series a little worried. In 1968, Bill Theiss admitted, "When I first met Jill Ireland, she was a little uneasy about me. I didn't find out until later it was because she had seen Sherry Jackson's costume, and she was afraid I was going to do something as revealing with her. She could have carried it well, but the script would have been ill-served by having her wear something as revealing as that." While the clothing was not stirring, Ireland's performance was. Dory Fontana said Jill Ireland as Layla Kalomi was exquisite. Ralph Sininsky said Jill Ireland and I had not worked together, but of course I had heard of her. I didn't cast her since I was busy looking for a location, but Frank Overton I'd done 4 shows with on 12 O'Clock High. Let's see if I can find a good image of him. Come on. Yeah, there he is. Okay, so Frank Overton, I'd done 4 shows with on 12 O'Clock High, a wonderful actor and a very nice man. Overton, cast as Elias Sandoval, had nearly 100 appearances in film and television, including multiple roles on The Twilight Zone, Wagon Train, and Bonanza, and a recurring role for 3 seasons on 12 O'Clock High as an Army Air Corps major. On the big screen, among many classic films, Overton played Sheriff Heck Tate in To Kill a Mockingbird. Less than 6 months after filming This Side of Paradise, Frank Overton died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 48. Grant Woods, following appearances in the Galileo 7 and Arena, returned for his third and final time as crewman Kelowitz. That's the biologist. That's it. Yeah, I remember him now. Let's see. I think, I think he's one of the guy in that scenes where they're fighting. Yeah, he's one of the guys he's the guy on the ground there. And Michael Barrier was back for a second turn as Lieutenant DeSalle, um, having been featured prominently in The Squire of Gothos. Barrier and his character DeSalle would return to command the bridge in Catspaw. Okay, and a short time after making This Side of Paradise, Grant Woods would die in a motorcycle accident. As for those meddling plants and their projectile spores, something like them had been seen before. A specimen unknown, a 1964 episode of The Outer Limits, also had alien plants that shot spores. Hua Ching created them, and he created the ones seen in this episode as well. The next hurdle to clear was to find a place to represent the settlement on Omicron Ceti 3. Sininsky said, "Our big thing was to find the location. There wasn't the time or money to build anything, so we had to use something that was already built. The only place was the Disney Film Ranch, which was totally wrong unless you use some creative imagination that they had gone to the past. Golden Oak, Golden Oak Ranch, owned by Walt Disney Productions, was the home of Swamp Fox and Zorro. Located near Santa Clarita, a couple hours drive from Hollywood, it was also close to Vasquez Rocks and Africa, USA, which the Star Trek company had recently visited. Golden Oak hardly looked futuristic. Yeah, it's obviously like a frontier town set. And it's also clearly because they're supposed to have been there 4 years, and this stuff's obviously older than 4 years, with the weathering of the paint and everything. I mean, I guess maybe you could argue that the Berthold rays cause the wood to age more quickly or something like that. With the revised script pages dated December 28th, Sandoval says to Kirk, "I think you'll find our settlement interesting. Our philosophy is a simple one, that men should return to the less complicated life. We have very few mechanical things here. No vehicles, no weapons. We have harmony here, complete peace." Now, filming began on Thursday, January 5th, 1967, the same day that the Galileo 7 aired that evening. The shooting schedule for This Side of Paradise provided for 3 days at Golden Oak to cover nearly a third of the script. Sininsky remembered, quote, "The first 2 days went swimmingly. We completed over 8 pages each day and were right on schedule, and all seemed as if I was filming was a rustic love story. Then came the third day. We reported to the ranch as usual in the dark so that we could be ready to film with the first light of day. But before the first light got to us, the news came that Jill Ireland would not be reporting to the location. It was feared that she had contracted the measles. This was on Monday. Ireland had fallen ill over the weekend and was scheduled to see a doctor later in the day. Sininsky added, "We then went to work completing all the scenes at the ranch that did not include her, after which we packed up, moved back to the studio, and finished the day filming on the Enterprise." On day 4, Tuesday, the bridge scenes were filmed, including those in which Kirk is the only one on the Enterprise. Fontana had written a hell of a scene for Shatner to play. She learned well from Roddenberry and understood the character. She knew Kirk would be the last to give up to the spores or give in to the spores. He was too driven, too content with his life to turn himself over to drink or drugs or women in the long term or spores. He would first have to be broken. And being so alone on the ship he loves, discovering that it is an empty love without the people who share the vessel with him, he clearly does break. Director Sininsky said, "The scene with Shatner alone on the bridge, he's just a wonderful actor." Fontana knew Kirk couldn't really leave the Enterprise. He would die first. For the next scene, she wrote, "Beneath the peace imposed on him by the spores is a surging, driving need to keep this job of his, this life, this self-made hell of command." As Kirk makes his way to the transporter room in a brief scene cut from the episode, Fontana wrote how he moves through the corridor. Every foot of it beloved by him, the great ship empty, deserted, but his one true love. In the transporter room, the script reads, "The conflict rises within him now, against the building transporter sound and lights. He should enter the chamber, but he can't. Instead, he turns off the console." Kirk shouts his next lines, "No, I can't leave you." Kirk would change that last word, feeling it rang too much like Kirk's confession of "I'll never lose you" from The Naked Time. But whether one reads Fontana's final handling of the script or Kuhn's polish, this side of paradise is stirring. The script, like so many others from the original Star Trek, is in a league of its own. A comparison with the writing of other contemporaneous series, or with later series for that matter, helps to explain the enduring popularity of Star Trek for nearly half a century and counting. These scripts, based on strong original series concepts and well drawn characters, were among the best written television ever known. Now, good news arrived concerning the condition of Jill Ireland. The measles turned out to be something less serious, and she would be able to return to finish her work. After, oh, okay, so January 7th, Friday, an extra day was added into the production. This day was intended for a return to Golden Oak Ranch for pickup shots with Ireland, but the ranch was unable to accommodate the schedule change. Therefore, another location had to be found, and quickly, one that would match the look of Golden Oak and not be available and be available on the only day the company could still film with Ireland. After numerous frantic phone calls, Justman was able to book nearby Bronson Canyon on the south edge of Griffith Park in the Hollywood Hills. Of course, Bronson Canyon bore no resemblance to Golden Oak Ranch. There were no oaks, nor was there anything golden or even remotely green. Bronson Canyon was and is basically a rock pit with caves. The location, in fact, was a former quarry operated by the Union Rock Company at the turn of the last century, which extracted the rock needed to pave the streets of nearby Los Angeles. Sineski marveled. "I was amazed then, and now, itching toward half a century later, I'm still in awe of those studio magicians who, in answer to a request for a garden in the middle of a pristine green landscape, in the middle of a rock pile, could fulfill my request." Among other scenes filmed here were those in which Spock gets hit by the spores and as a result falls head over heels in love, literally. Of the famous tree scene, Leonard Nimoy remained uneasy and later said, quote, "Even after we began shooting the episode, I found it both scary and liberating to emote as Spock. How would fans react to seeing the cool, rational Vulcan literally swinging from a tree?" That business on the tree, that over the head over heels playfulness was improvised. Sininsky said the scene was all set up and ready to shoot with Kirk and Spock meeting in the center of a field. Jerry Finnerman had lit it and we did a run through and it was just dull. They were just standing there facing each other. Nothing was working. Something said to me, I've got to do something more with this. And then, right out of camera range, he saw a tree with a strange limb. So I asked Jerry if I could change the setup, which I seldom do, and he said, of course. So we went over and had Spock hang from the tree. Well, they all loved it, and I remember there was a lovely response to the comedy element that Shatner brought into this performance. This Side of Paradise finished one day behind schedule, but since a key cast member had fallen ill, production insurance paid for the overage, sparing Desilu a financial hit. Ralph Sininsky, who had felt disappointed when Robert Justman switched scripts on him, later said, as it worked out, This Side of Paradise was the better show for me to be doing my first time out. And quite frankly, I probably did the show better than anybody else directing for them could have done it. Curiously, some of Star Trek's best episodes are also among the least expensive to make. The Corbomite Maneuver, The Naked Time, Charlie X, and Tomorrow is Yesterday were all brought in under budget. And even with location filming and the cost of an extra day of production, This Side of Paradise was brought in under the studio allowance, with a total cost of only $171,681, bringing the season's financial deficit to $76,117. Now, the show aired March 2nd, 1967. It actually was second in the ratings in its first half hour, behind Bewitched, as always. Um, and then second again behind the Thursday night movie in the second half hour. The movie that night was Bye Bye Birdie. But it did have a rerun on August 10th during the summer. And in the first half hour, it won its time slot. But then it dropped to second place with the second half hour. Entertainment Weekly also liked the episode. The magazine picked this as the 8th best Star Trek episode of all time. Putting aside any qualms he had during the production, Leonard Nimoy liked This Side of Paradise too. He picked it as among his half dozen favorites. Jerry Soule, however, was determined not to like it and expressed his hurt in many ways. First, he called his science fiction pals, who had also written for Star Trek, comparing experiences and seeing that many were disgruntled over being severely rewritten by, quote, a TV guy named Roddenberry. Convinced that he and his colleagues had been used by a member of the Hollywood crowd, Soule refused to allow his name, one of those feathers in Gene Roddenberry's cap that he was so proud of, to be further exploited, and insisted his screen credit read Nathan Butler. Hello, Jay Rocker. Thank you for stopping by, sir. It's good to see you. Harlan Ellison, who was still on board with Star Trek at this point, was bothered by this action and the rumblings from his fellow sci fi elites. He went public with his opinions, blasting Soule and the others in the November 1966 issue of the Science Fiction Writers Award Association. In early January 1967, Soule fired back with a letter of his own addressed to Damon Knight, editor of the newsletter. Soule wrote, Gene Roddenberry needed science fiction writers to get a feeling about science fiction for his show, to flesh out the stories and characters, so to speak. He paid for them. He got them. They gave him their all. When his show was off and running, Roddenberry didn't need them anymore. He'd gotten what he wanted. Now the hacks could get on with it. The fact that Roddenberry has turned his back on all of us is unfortunate and disappointing, for we all thought Roddenberry was of a different caliber. We did our best. Richard Matheson, Robert Bloch, Theodore Sturgeon, A.E. Van Vogt, myself, and others. Perhaps all Harlan Ellison and Gene Roddenberry find that disappointing. I do not. Now, Roddenberry then sent a private letter to Frederick Pohl, another sci-fi writer, but I'm not going to read it. It's pretty long. But a month later, Soule had cooled down a bit. He then sent Roddenberry a short but sweet peace offering, writing, Dear Gene, that episode of Star Trek with Ricardo Montalban, Space Seed, was, in my estimation, the show's finest hour. Warmest regards, Jerry. Roddenberry responded, but not necessarily warmly. His letter read, quote, Dear Jerry, thank you for your comments on the Star Trek episode Space Seed, starring Ricardo Montalban. Comments on individual episodes are always helpful and always appreciated. Yours truly, Gene Roddenberry. There was no mistaking the tone. Someone was going to have to instigate a conversation and try to repair the damage. Soul, knowing he had fired the first shot, now knew he would have to swallow his pride. His letter to Roddenberry a few days later attempted to explain his side of the misunderstanding. And again, I'm not going to read it all. Soul added that much of his confusion and hurt came about as a result of Harlan Ellison's tirade in the Science Fiction Writers Association newsletter. He believed Ellison was speaking on behalf of Roddenberry, accusing Matheson, George Clayton Johnson, and himself of being leeches who were trying to grab a few bucks from those TV schmucks. Soul couldn't understand how Roddenberry, his newfound TV friend, could think such things after all the help he had given Star Trek in the early days, recommending writers for the series and helping to flesh out the characters and premise with his Corbomite maneuver script. And so he reacted as he did, and now he was sorry. Soul closed his letter writing, I have been guilty of not being patient, of not being trusting. I have been judging instead of loving. For all that all I can ask is your forgiveness. Love, Jerry. Roddenberry, however, wasn't feeling forgiving or loving. He wrote back, let me correct a few misconceptions. Firstly, Harlan doesn't speak for me. Star Trek has not reverted to Hollywood hacks. I have never produced a show using hacks, nor do I ever intend to. Reference your assistance during the early stages of Star Trek. I am most grateful for it. However, let's not create any legends between ourselves that you introduced me to science fiction. I have been a fan of that field of literature since the 1930s, written one of television's early sci-fi scripts, The Secret Weapon of 117, and had the Star Trek format and first pilot conceived and executed before we even met. Understand this is not to diminish the value of your friendly and even enthusiastic cooperation. There is, however, one damage which has not been repaired. In the article printed in the SFWA, you intimated that I'm a liar and a cheat, or at least so a number of people interpreted it. I feel that you owe it to me and to yourself to find some way in that same publication to correct that infamous letter as you describe it. Sincerely yours, Gene Roddenberry. Soule attempted to clear up the matter with the Science Fiction Writers Association. Roddenberry, smarting over the accusations that the science fiction writers, having written for Star Trek so far, would never return, attempted some damage control of his own, writing to the SFWA newsletter editor Damon Knight. Incidentally, Harlan can hardly be characterized as a leech, since we have not even shot his show yet. We intend to before the season is out, and liking it very much, we will undoubtedly want to sign him for further scripts should we go to a second season. Yeah, don't bet on that. Ted Sturgeon has already been signed for a second. Robert Bloch and Richard Matheson have received offers from us, and we are waiting until they get some free time. We have contacted Lester Del Rey, Paul Anderson, Isaac Asimov, Norman Spinrad, and others soliciting ideas for stories, although we are bought up for this particular season. We're hoping to heavily use such talent should we go to a second year. The second assignment Roddenberry referred to for Theodore Sturgeon, planned for the end of the first season, was Amok Time. Norman Spinrad would respond and send in an idea, although not the one that eventually was purchased, and it would eventually become the Doomsday Machine. Bloch would return to write for Star Trek again with Catspaw and Wolf in the Fold. And Richard Matheson came in for a pitch but didn't stir interest with his idea. The others would all pass. As for Jerry Soule, he remained estranged from Roddenberry for over a year. He would get a chance to write for Star Trek again, but not until the halfway point of season 3, and that experience would not go well. And that episode would be Whom Gods Destroy. All right, now this is a letter that was sent out 11 days after the completion of filming of This Side of Paradise. Quote, Dear Ralph, I would like to have you know how much I enjoyed the work that we did together on This Side of Paradise. It was not only a special Spock experience, but it was special for me as well in that I felt safe in the hands of a capable and sensitive director. Unfortunately, a rare experience in TV. I sincerely hope we will spend much more time working together on sound stages and locations in the future. Many, many thanks. Sincerely, Leonard Nimoy. Jerry Thinnerman, who was the cinematographer for Star Trek, was as impressed with Sininsky as Sininsky was with him, and said, "This Side of Paradise was a well directed show. I thought he did a wonderful job at directing the women, and this includes Jill Ireland and then Eleanor Donahue and Diana Muldar in future episodes. And he had a sensitivity to him, and he wouldn't compromise either. I liked that about him." Ralph Sininsky said, "This Side of Paradise has to do with love, the ability to love and the themes that go beyond the confines of the space genre in which it was written. I've always loved that last line where Spock says, 'For the first time in my life, I was happy.' That pulls on the heart, and it makes a universal statement which TV or movies too seldom make today." Of the episode, Dorothy Fontana said, "I love it. I thought it worked out really well, and NBC liked it very much, and Gene liked it very much, so I got to be the story editor." Okay. What I'm right at an hour, so that'll do it for this side of paradise. And as I said, yeah, an A plus episode, definitely one of Star Trek's best. Now, I'm gonna have my National Guard drill this weekend, so I will not be streaming this Sunday evening like I usually do, and I probably will not do a Trek Talk next week either. I'll probably be a little too easy. So in 2 weeks, I will be back, and that episode, what is it going to be again? Oh, yeah, The Devil in the Dark. Yeah. So The Devil in the Dark, 2 weeks from today. I want to thank everyone who tuned in for the stream, and also for those who will tune in later on a rewatch. And I hope that you will all have a pleasant evening, and I will see you then. Good night.